Two smug cops walked into court thinking they'd walk free after framing a young Latino man, until a calm, well-dressed black woman took the stand and revealed she was the DEA director. The courthouse in Paso Robles was already warm by 8:15 a.m., the kind of dry heat that made starched uniforms stick to the skin. But officers Mark Rutledge and Brian Colton didn't seem bothered. Their navy blues were spotless, their boots polished like mirrors, and their faces carried the smugness of men who'd been through this dance before, and always came out clean. Mark leaned toward Brian as they approached the courtroom door. "Judge Halbrook's presiding. She's been soft on us before," he muttered, chewing on a toothpick like it was part of the uniform. Brian gave a short chuckle, tugging his belt into place. "We'll be out by lunch." Behind them trailed two department reps, there more for appearances than anything else. The Paso Robles Police Department had quietly backed its officers in situations like this for years. Internal affairs reports were filtered. Complaints by civilians mysteriously disappeared. The quiet rule was, don't make a mess, and the system will clean up behind you. Inside Department 2B, the benches were already half full. Community members, reporters, and a few law students sat watching, whispering. On the prosecution side sat Javier Montes, a 22-year-old student from San Luis Obispo. He didn't look like trouble. He looked like someone who should have been studying for midterms, not sitting in a courtroom with two officers staring him down. His public defender, a woman in her 30s named Lynn Tran, was flipping through her notes with a focused calm. She'd seen the video, what little there was. A dashcam clip with a mysteriously missing 36 seconds. The part where Javier was pulled out of the car and thrown face first onto the asphalt? Gone. Lynn knew exactly who she was up against. Mark and Brian took their seats with confidence, even exaggerating their movements a little, as if to say, "Look at us. We're not worried." The judge entered, brisk and unreadable, her robe sweeping behind her. A quick rise, a muttered, "All rise," and the trial began. The DA, a man named Philip Greer, opened with a few generic words about public trust and due process. It was dry and safe. Mark leaned toward Brian again. "He's sandbagging. Doesn't want this to blow up," he whispered. Brian smirked, just like we thought. As Javier took the stand, the room quieted. His mother, sitting behind him, clutched her purse like it was the only thing anchoring her to the floor. His voice cracked once or twice, but he held it together. He talked about how he'd just gotten off a late shift at the gas station, how he'd been pulled over for drifting, how Officer Rutledge had yanked him out without warning. "They said I looked nervous, that I had weed. I didn't. I told them to check the car. They said they already did." "And did they find anything?" Lynn asked. "Yeah, a baggie under my seat, but I swear it wasn't mine. I clean my car every 2 days. I work for Uber, too." The prosecution didn't ask many questions on cross, just poked around his work history, tried to get him to admit he had smoked before, but the core of his testimony stood. Still, you could feel it in the air. No one expected this to go far. The department had a reputation for swallowing these cases whole. The audience leaned back, probably waiting for the judge to call a recess and for everyone to pretend this was another misunderstanding. But then Lynn stood up again. "Your Honor, we'd like to call one more witness before the morning session ends." Rutledge raised an eyebrow. That wasn't in the pre-trial motion. "Proceed," said Judge Halbrook. Lynn nodded toward the door. The bailiff opened it. In walked a woman. Black, early 50s, tall, hair pulled back in a neat twist, wearing a grey suit that didn't wrinkle when she moved. She walked straight past everyone, heels silent, eyes steady. Not a flicker of emotion. Lynn gestured. "This is Ms. Danielle Freeman." Mark scoffed under his breath. "Another civilian crying race." Brian rolled his eyes. "Watch her start talking about systemic bias. Seen it before." But Danielle didn't take the witness stand right away. She turned to the bailiff and pulled something from her blazer pocket. A leather badge wallet. She handed it to him without a word. The bailiff looked at it, blinked, looked again. Danielle turned to the judge and the courtroom. "My name is Danielle Freeman," she said clearly. director of the Los Angeles Field Division of the Drug Enforcement Administration. And just like that, every smirk in that courtroom vanished. But things were only beginning to crack. The officers hadn't realized yet. This wasn't just about Javier. The silence in the room after Danielle's introduction felt like gravity had doubled. Mark shifted in his seat. Brian's hand twitched against the wood of the bench, a habit he had when he was trying to look calm, but wasn't. Danielle hadn't even sat down yet, and already they were off balance. But Lynn Tran didn't rush it. She let the moment breathe. "Before we proceed with Ms. Freeman," she said to the judge, "we'd like to complete the personal account of the victim in this case. Javier Montes. He deserves to finish his story uninterrupted." The judge gave a brief nod. Danielle stepped aside quietly, folding her hands in front of her. Javier returned to the stand. This time, the air felt different, like the court was finally listening. Lynn walked back up to him. "Javier, I know it's difficult, but I want you to take us back to that night again. The moments before the stop." He glanced at the officers. Mark tilted his head as if daring him to speak. Brian looked at the ceiling, like it was all beneath him. Javier focused forward. "It was March 12th. Around 10:30 p.m., I had just dropped off a rider near Templeton. It was quiet. I was tired. I just wanted to get home. Did you know you were being followed?" "No, not at first. I noticed headlights behind me for a while, but I thought it was just another car. Then the lights flashed. I pulled over right away." Lynn nodded slowly. "What happened next?" He hesitated, voice getting quieter. "I rolled my window down. Officer Rutledge came up, asked me where I was coming from. I said I just finished work. He told me to get out. I asked why. He said I was acting shifty. I said I wasn't." "Did he say what he stopped you for?" "He said I was swerving, but I wasn't. I have dashcam footage. It showed my lane was straight, but part of that video's gone." Lynn looked at the judge. "For the record, a 36-second segment of the footage provided by the department is missing. The timestamp jumps." "Objection. Sustained," the judge said firmly, silencing the DA before he could finish. "Please continue," Lynn said. "They pulled me out," Javier went on. "Pushed me against the car. Officer Colton searched me. Then they went through the car. Took stuff out. Didn't say what. 20 minutes later, they said they found a bag under the seat." He swallowed hard. "It wasn't mine. I'd just vacuumed the car earlier that day. I drive rideshare. I always clean it. I told them. They laughed. One of them said, 'Bet you've had all kinds of people in here. Who knows what you're hauling?' Murmurs broke out in the gallery. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. "And then?" Lynn asked. "They arrested me. No Miranda, no explanation. Just cuffs and silence. I called my mum from the station. She didn't even know where I was for 2 hours." Javier's mother blinked fast but didn't cry. She had probably run out of tears months ago. Brian leaned closer to Mark. "He's playing it up," he whispered. Mark muttered, "This kid's about to get crushed. DEA or no DEA." But Danielle heard them. She tilted her head just slightly in their direction, not enough to make a scene, just enough to let them know they weren't invisible anymore. Javier sat upright again. "I got suspended from my job after that. Uber locked me out of my account while the charges were pending. I had to borrow money from my cousin to pay rent. My friends, some of them didn't believe me. They thought I was hiding something, that I got caught." He exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. "But I didn't. I swear to God I didn't." Lynn turned to the judge. "No further questions." The DA stood slowly. He paced a little, then stopped in front of Javier. "Mr. Montes, have you ever used marijuana before?" "Once at a party, 3 years ago. Were you driving that night?" "No." The DA paused. "And you're telling this court that someone planted that bag in your car?" "Yes." "You didn't know it was there?" "No." The DA let that hang in the air like it was supposed to prove something. "No further questions," he said, walking back to his seat. The judge called for a 5-minute recess. As people stood to stretch, Mark leaned back and cracked his knuckles. "You hear that?" he said to Brian. "Even the kid admits he's not clean," Brian snorted. "They never are." But Danielle was still standing near the front, hands clasped. She was watching them. not blinking, just watching. But the calmness in her stare wasn't stillness, it was precision, and the storm behind it hadn't even started. The courtroom was quieter than before. People weren't just listening now. They were leaning in. Reporters who had looked half asleep during opening statements were scribbling notes faster. Even the judge, usually hard to read, kept her eyes fixed on the witness list, like she was trying to guess what was coming next. 5 minutes passed. When the recess ended, Judge Halbrook adjusted her glasses and said, "Counsel, you may proceed." Lin Tran didn't hesitate. "Your Honor, we now call Director Danielle Freeman to the stand." This time she added the title loud enough for everyone to hear. Not Ms., not Doctor, not Officer, but Director. The word echoed. Danielle walked calmly to the witness chair. Every step she took sounded like it belonged to someone who'd spent years walking through federal buildings, not courtrooms like this. She took her seat, crossed one leg over the other, and looked straight ahead. Lin approached. "Director Freeman, thank you for being here today. For the court, could you please state your full title and role?" Danielle turned toward the judge. "Danielle Freeman. I am the director of the Los Angeles Field Division of the Drug Enforcement Administration. I've held that position for 6 years. Prior to that, I served in the Washington, D.C. office and worked in federal drug investigations for over 2 decades. She didn't boast. She didn't flinch. She simply said it like it was fact. Brian Colton blinked, suddenly looking pale. Mark muttered under his breath, "This is bull." Why would the DEA care about this? As if on cue, Lin asked, "Director Freeman, could you explain why a federal agency such as yours would take interest in a traffic stop in Paso Robles?" Danielle took a moment. It didn't begin with Javier Montes. It began with a series of traffic stops involving young Latino and black men between Paso Robles and San Miguel. Most had no criminal records. Some had their vehicles searched without cause. In several instances, illegal substances were found, but not one of those substances matched the fingerprints or DNA of the driver. Lin nodded. "And how did this come to your attention?" An anonymous letter was sent to my office in November. It contained bodycam stills from Officer Rutledge and an unedited internal report with redacted timestamps. We began an internal inquiry. It led to a surveillance investigation. Judge Halbrook leaned forward. "Are you saying this courtroom is now involved in an active DEA investigation?" "Yes, Your Honor." Danielle replied. "We've been gathering evidence quietly to avoid tipping off potential suspects." A low hum of murmurs swept through the courtroom again. This wasn't a routine case anymore. This was something bigger. Lin continued, "Director Freeman, can you clarify what you mean by surveillance?" Danielle placed a folder on her lap and opened it. "We traced the patrol cars used by Officers Rutledge and Colton. GPS logs showed route inconsistencies, routine stops on days they weren't scheduled. We also recovered deleted dashcam footage and digital logs that contradict the written reports. Multiple arrest records from the last 14 months match a pattern. Stop, search, arrest. Then all charges mysteriously dropped within weeks." Mark's jaw clenched. Brian's knee started bouncing. Danielle kept going. "Additionally, we have testimony from 2 former officers who left the department due to what they described as a toxic culture of cover-ups. Their stories were consistent. One of them witnessed Officer Colton planting evidence in a suspect's glove box. He reported it. 2 weeks later, he was reassigned. He resigned a month after that." The DA tried to object. "Your Honor, we haven't seen any of this evidence." "You will," Lin said, "when we submit it to the federal grand jury next week." Silence again. Danielle turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, we delayed arrests to avoid interference in this hearing, but I can assure this court that arrest warrants are being prepared for both officers based on federal charges of obstruction, falsification of reports, and civil rights violations." Brian muttered, "They can't do this. They can't do this in court." Mark leaned forward, whispering frantically to his attorney. "Tell them this isn't legal. Tell the judge this is all fabricated. Say something." But no one moved. The judge just sat there, quiet, her eyes locked on Danielle. The court reporter's fingers danced across the keyboard. Even the bailiff didn't breathe. Danielle closed her folder and looked directly at Mark and Brian. "I didn't come here to make a point," she said. "I came here to expose a pattern, one that's been protected by silence, uniform, and authority. But authority doesn't excuse abuse, not in my jurisdiction." But what rattled them more wasn't what she said. It was how many people in that room were starting to believe her. For the first time since the trial began, the courtroom didn't feel like Mark and Brian's domain. They weren't in control anymore. The air didn't bend around them the way it used to, the way it did back at the precinct, where people laughed at their jokes and turned their heads when paperwork didn't quite line up. They sat motionless, their attorneys whispering now, no longer confident enough to object or interrupt. Lynn stepped back, giving Danielle the floor. It was a deliberate move. No need to ask another question. Danielle knew what she came to do. She opened a second file folder and handed the contents to the bailiff. "This is a timeline of 11 separate incidents tied to Officers Rutledge and Colton," she said calmly. "Each case involved minority drivers. Each arrest was made on suspicion of drug possession. And each one, without exception, had the same chain of events. Traffic stop, vehicle search without consent, a small amount of narcotics found in a non-secured location, and then charges dropped once a defense attorney reviewed the footage or requested lab analysis." The judge flipped through the pages silently. Danielle continued. "The narcotics seized, when tested, had no traces of the defendant's fingerprints. Not once. That's statistically improbable to the point of impossible. DEA labs flagged the anomalies, which triggered our internal alert." Mark leaned into his attorney's ear. "Tell her she's bluffing. We handled evidence right. Chain of custody was clean." But his attorney didn't look sure. Danielle glanced toward the jury. "This wasn't sloppy work. It was rehearsed, controlled. These weren't accidents." Her voice didn't rise. If anything, it grew quieter, which made the courtroom even more still. "And then came the warehouse," she said. Lynn tilted her head slightly, signaling for her to explain. Danielle nodded. "On March 3rd, we received a tip about an unregistered facility off Kyler Canyon Road. Surveillance footage showed a marked cruiser entering the property multiple times after hours. The building was being used to store evidence, off the record. None of the materials matched active cases logged by the Paso Robles PD." She handed another photo to the bailiff. It was grainy, but clear enough. Officer Colton unlocking a rusted warehouse door. He looked over his shoulder, right into the camera. Brian sat forward, fast, hands on his knees now. That's not what it looks like," he said. Danielle ignored him. "We found bags of narcotics, cash, unregistered weapons, all in crates marked for training simulations. None were logged, no receipts, no storage documentation." Lynn stood up again, pacing now. "So what you're telling this court, Director Freeman, is that Officers Rutledge and Colton weren't just engaging in misconduct, they were operating outside of department protocol entirely." "Yes, and they weren't alone. But they were consistent. They had patterns." Brian jumped to his feet. "This is crap. She's spinning this. Where's the audio? The real evidence?" The judge raised a hand. "Sit down, Officer Colton." He hesitated, but then he did. Danielle leaned forward just slightly. "You want audio?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. "We installed an audio sniffer device in your cruiser after the second suspicious arrest in January. It recorded everything for 8 days. Then again 2 weeks later. You talked about keeping extra bags on hand, just in case. About where to ditch the stuff if you got pulled over. You even joked about how nobody would believe a nervous-looking kid with weed in his sock." Mark was stone still. His face didn't twitch. His eyes didn't blink. Only his fingers, tapping once against the bench, gave him away. Danielle placed the USB on the desk next to the judge. "That drive is sealed and logged, verified by 2 independent lab techs. If you press play, you'll hear the truth in your own voices." The DA stood up, trying to object again. But even he looked unsure what to say. The judge held up her hand. "We will recess for 1 hour," she said. "The court will reconvene at 1:30, and I expect full cooperation with the DEA's evidence handling protocols." Bam! Gavel! The room erupted, not with shouting, just a swirl of movement, whispers, people standing too quickly, some reaching for phones. Reporters were already running toward the hallway. Mark and Brian sat like mannequins. Their attorneys leaned in close, whispering fast now, huddled tight. The look of two men who finally realized they weren't walking out of this clean. Lynn Tran quietly packed her files, never once looking at them. Danielle stepped back from the stand and walked out the side door, calm, deliberate, like nothing had changed, even though everything had. But the silence between Mark and Brian as the door shut behind her said more than any sentence ever could. The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with footsteps and low voices. Reporters hovered near the exit, speaking quickly into their phones, trying to figure out what just happened. But inside the private break room behind Department 2B, the atmosphere was starkly different. Mark Rutledge stood against the wall, arms crossed so tightly his knuckles were turning white. Brian paced. He was sweating now, the fabric of his uniform darkening under the arms. Their lawyers had stepped out for a moment, probably to speak with the DA. That left the two officers alone, finally, and the silence between them wasn't comfortable anymore. "I told you not to go near that warehouse after hours," Mark hissed. Brian shot him a look. "You're blaming me? You think I planted that camera? You think I knew the DEA was watching?" Mark didn't respond. He was thinking. Fast. But it was like trying to find your way out of a maze that's closing in. Back inside the courtroom, Danielle was back at the stand. Judge Halbrook returned early and called court back into session 20 minutes ahead of schedule. She didn't say why. She didn't have to. The entire room could feel it. The case had snapped wide open. Danielle opened a slim laptop and turned it toward the judge. "This is a log of the cruiser's GPS movements. On February 9th, it shows a detour off the main patrol route, 4 miles from where the official report says the stop occurred. The real location matches where the anonymous tipster said Officers Rutledge and Colton were pre-planting evidence." Lynn moved closer to the monitor, examining the data. "Do these logs show patterns of behavior?" "Yes. Over the course of 6 weeks, we saw a recurring set of locations. Abandoned lots, dead-end roads, and unregistered storage sheds. Same officers, same times of day. We cross-referenced it with booking data. 11 arrests happened within 30 minutes of those detours." Lynn turned toward the jury. "Were all the defendants people of color?" "Yes. Every single one," the courtroom murmured again. Judge Halbrook raised a hand but didn't gavel it. She let it settle on its own. Something about the weight of Danielle's words made people quiet down fast. "Director Freeman," Lynn asked, "how were these Jeep records obtained?" "They were collected under warrant. After preliminary red flags were triggered in our internal database, we initiated digital monitoring through standard federal procedure. Everything is court admissible. The logs were verified by a third-party data analyst." Mark and Brian had returned by then, but they sat differently now. Rigid. Silent. Neither looked at Danielle. The judge turned toward the defense table. "Officers, do you have anything you'd like to say regarding these allegations before I consider granting a full federal review?" Mark's lawyer stood. "Your Honor, given the nature of this hearing, we request a delay in proceedings so we may properly review all new evidence presented today." Lynn responded immediately. "That would only give them more time to manipulate records or pressure witnesses. Every moment wasted puts more people at risk." Brian's attorney looked toward the DA, hoping for backup, but Greer, the district attorney, wasn't moving. His face had gone still the moment Danielle brought up the warehouse. It wasn't just about 2 bad cops now. It was about exposure, lawsuits, federal oversight. His office was cornered. Danielle turned her gaze toward the jury. "You don't have to believe me," she said. "Believe the data. Believe the body cams, the digital trails, the arrest patterns, the inconsistencies in paperwork. We didn't build this case overnight. It took months. It took people risking their careers, whistleblowers, analysts, and community members brave enough to speak up when they thought no one was listening." She paused. "I've seen corruption before. I've chased it through bigger cities, across agencies, in international task forces. But what I saw here, it wasn't just procedural misconduct. It was racial profiling disguised as protocol. It was power abused so casually that these men thought it would never catch up to them." She looked directly at Mark. "Until today." Mark didn't flinch. But Brian cracked. He leaned forward and whispered to his attorney, not caring who saw. His voice carried. "They've got audio, GPS, warehouse footage. What do we even fight? What's left?" The courtroom heard him. Lynn heard him. Even Judge Halbrook's pen stopped mid-scratch on her notes. Brian sat back in his chair and looked straight ahead, chest rising and falling fast. That was the moment. The exact second. Everyone in the room knew he was finished. Danielle clicked her laptop shut, gently. The system bends too often for people in uniform, but the moment we stop holding each other accountable is the moment the badge means nothing. But what Danielle didn't say, what she didn't need to say, was that the real trial hadn't even started yet. They were breaking. Brian looked like a balloon with too much air, red-faced, twitchy, talking to himself under his breath. Mark was doing the opposite. Still, silent, rigid. His shoulders locked back like he was holding up armor that no longer worked. The judge recessed again, this time for 10 minutes. No one moved. Brian didn't even bother to leave the courtroom. He just sat forward, elbows on knees, hands pressed together, rocking slightly. His lawyer leaned in, trying to get him to breathe slower. Across the aisle, Lynn Trun stayed seated, eyes on her files, as if organizing papers could help her steady the emotion behind her expression. She had seen cases collapse before, usually hers, but not this time. Danielle stood near the side wall, phone in hand, speaking quietly into it. From the way her eyes moved, tracking the corners of the room, you could tell she wasn't just reporting in. She was still watching. When court resumed, the tension was a live thing. Even the jury, many of whom had come in with blank expressions, looked sharper now. People were taking notes, watching body language. No one in that room was asleep anymore. Lynn stood up. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to play a short segment from the audio surveillance collected by the DEA. Mark's attorney immediately stood. "Objection. The defense has not authenticated or reviewed the contents." Judge Halbrook cut him off. "Overruled. This evidence was gathered under a federal warrant and has been submitted as part of the record. Continue." The bailiff brought a speaker to the bench. Danielle approached and connected the drive. There was a short, static pop. Then the voice came through. It was Mark's. "You see the guy's eyes? He was going to piss himself before we even opened the door." Brian laughed. "Yeah, had that twitch. You can always tell when they're hiding something, even if they ain't." Mark again. "I say we toss the sock trick. Quick plant, nothing major. Keeps 'em scared." Then silence. Then laughter. Brian's voice. "Hell, we're doing 'em a favor. Teaching 'em to keep their mouths shut next time." The jury shifted in their seats. One of the jurors, an older woman with short grey hair, looked like she wanted to throw up. Mark's attorney stood again. "This is wildly out of context. Banter between officers doesn't prove misconduct." Danielle didn't even blink. "That's not banter, that's practice. And it continues for 42 more minutes. I only brought one clip." The judge looked at her. "Is this part of the sealed record?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Then I'll review it in full." The clip stopped. The room didn't move. Mark finally turned toward Brian, eyes sharp. "You kept talking. I told you. Always shut it off. You forgot the damn mic." Brian snapped. "You act like this was just me? We did this together. You planted more than I ever did." The courtroom reacted like someone had dropped glass. Lynn didn't even have to say a word. Judge Halbrook adjusted her robe, leaned into her mic. "Officer Colton, one more outburst and I will have you removed." Brian sat back, hands shaking. He didn't say another word. Danielle looked at the jury. "There's a reason these recordings matter. It's not just about catching someone. It's about showing you what happens when silence protects power. These weren't isolated moments. This was a system, built inside a department, with officers who believed the badge made them untouchable." Mark leaned to his lawyer again, voice low but audible. "We're not taking the fall for the whole thing. This goes higher. She knows it, too." Danielle heard it. Her eyes didn't flinch, but her fingers pressed slightly tighter against the edge of the podium. Outside the courtroom, another DEA agent appeared at the door. He whispered something to the bailiff. The judge called him forward. A small piece of paper was handed to her. She read it. They'd set it down gently. "Director Freeman," she said, "I've been informed that federal arrest warrants for Officers Rutledge and Colton have been signed as of 5 minutes ago." The courtroom stilled again. "Deputies," the judge said, "you are to detain both defendants immediately." The sound of chairs scraping filled the room. 2 uniformed deputies moved forward. Mark stood up calmly, almost defiantly. Brian didn't move until the cuffs were already being fastened. As the deputies guided them out of the courtroom, Mark turned to look at Danielle. Not scared, just bitter. "You think this ends with us?" he said. Danielle didn't reply. She just watched them walk out, like she'd seen it before, like she already knew the answer. But there was still more to this case, because while 2 men were being led away, the department that trained them was still standing. The courtroom door shut behind Mark and Brian with a heavy click, and for a moment, the room was just still. People didn't know whether to feel victorious or afraid. The 2 officers were gone, yes, but no one believed they had acted alone. Lynn Tran turned to Judge Halbrook. "Your Honor, we request permission to present further background on the department's internal culture. To understand how Officers Rutledge and Colton operated so freely, we need to address how they were enabled." Judge Halbrook nodded once. "Proceed." Danielle returned to the stand, but her tone shifted. Less clinical now, more personal. "I want to be very clear," she began. "Not every officer in that department was corrupt, but the good ones didn't last long. They either transferred out, or they quit." She paused, opened another file. "I want to talk about one of them. His name was Elijah Dunn. He was 26. Joined the Paso Robles PD fresh out of the academy in Monterey. Eager, honest, quiet. The kind of kid who still called his mother after night shifts." She held up a document, a letter. "This is his resignation notice, dated February 4th. He wrote, 'I'm not quitting because of fear. I'm quitting because I refuse to be another bystander with a badge.'" Lynn asked softly, "Did he report anything before resigning?" "Yes. He filed 2 internal complaints, one against Colton, one against a sergeant who pressured him to change his report after a traffic stop. Both were dismissed within a week. The official department log claimed the footage was inconclusive. We recovered that footage through his personal backup. It showed a clear contradiction." The judge leaned in. "Was this footage submitted to the state?" Danielle hesitated. "It should have been, but the department never forwarded it. The report disappeared. Elijah's file was flagged as incomplete and archived." A low voice from the jury. "That's a cover-up." Danielle looked at the juror but didn't respond directly. She didn't need to. Lynn stepped forward again. "Did Elijah cooperate with your investigation?" "Yes, he gave us names. Told us about code words used over the radio to indicate easy targets. 13B meant nervous. 19R meant young, male, likely alone. They weren't department codes. They were invented in-house." Brian's voice echoed from earlier in the trial. "Had that twitch. You can always tell." Danielle's voice hardened. "They weren't just using shortcuts. They had built a language for profiling. A routine. A rhythm." Judge Halbrook rubbed the bridge of her nose, as if trying to process the scale of it all. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. Lynn asked, "Were there others like Elijah?" "Yes. One officer, Leanne Orozco, spoke anonymously. She said the expectation was clear. Back your partner, no matter what, even if it doesn't feel right, especially if it doesn't feel right." She transferred to Bakersfield 6 months later. Said she couldn't sleep. Danielle looked down, then back up. "I know what that weight feels like." Lynn tilted her head. "Director Freeman, are you speaking from personal experience?" Danielle didn't blink. "Yes, I started in law enforcement when I was 22. Back then, I was the only black woman in my unit. I was assigned traffic for 2 years. I saw things I didn't know how to process. Until I got promoted, until I got access, until I could investigate properly." Her voice didn't shake, but it was quieter now, measured. "I saw how easy it is to become numb. How the badge becomes armor against accountability, and how silence becomes a currency." Someone in the back sniffled. Maybe a reporter. Maybe someone who knew Javier. Maybe someone who'd been stopped before and wondered if anyone believed them. Danielle tapped the desk once with her fingertip. This isn't about demonizing every cop. This is about drawing a hard line where lines haven't existed for years. Mark and Brian were gone, but their shadow still hung over the courtroom. Danielle closed the folder slowly, deliberately. I've worked long enough to know this case will make people uncomfortable. It should, because real change starts when comfort ends. But while she was finally being heard, others outside that courtroom were already trying to quiet her, because truth doesn't echo well in buildings built to keep it out. Outside the courthouse, a small group of uniformed officers gathered near the parking lot, flanked by a few unmarked sedans. Their presence wasn't subtle. Lieutenant Owen Krieger, a senior figure in the Paso Robles PD with 19 years on the force, had arrived just before the last recess. He wasn't scheduled to testify. He wasn't summoned. But somehow he was here anyway, flanked by 2 department attorneys and a media liaison who looked like he was already drafting a statement. Inside, Judge Halbrook had barely returned to the bench when the courtroom doors opened again. "Your Honor," said the deputy nearest the entrance. "Lieutenant Krieger is requesting to address the court." The judge raised an eyebrow. "On whose authority?" "His own, ma'am." A beat of silence. Then she nodded. "Bring him in." Krieger entered like a man who knew he was on a sinking ship, but was determined to keep the flag raised. His uniform was crisp, not a thread out of place. He walked like he'd practiced this moment in the mirror that morning. He didn't look at Danielle. That was deliberate. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to clarify that Officers Rutledge and Colton were not acting under direct instruction from the department. Their actions, if proven, represent individual misconduct, not systemic failure." Danielle didn't move, but Lynn stood up immediately. "With respect, Lieutenant, are you here to testify or to manage optics?" Krieger forced a smile. "I'm here because our department's name is being dragged through the mud." Judge Halbrook was not amused. "If you're here to testify, sit. If not, I suggest you leave." Krieger hesitated, but then he sat. Slowly. Danielle opened her folder again. "I anticipated this," she said plainly. "This is a signed memo from October, written by Lieutenant Krieger. It acknowledges that 2 separate complaints were filed against Officer Rutledge for excessive force. It also confirms that no disciplinary action was taken. The memo ends with the line, 'No further action warranted at this time.'" Lynn added, "Your Honor, we've found 4 more internal memos with identical phrasing. Each one followed an incident involving an unlawful search." Krieger stiffened. "That's standard language. Legal departments often guide phrasing in internal summaries." Danielle cut in. "Then let's look at actions, not words." She turned to the screen again. A new document appeared. "This is a bodycam review audit log from February. It shows that of the 24 videos flagged for irregularity, 19 were from Officers Rutledge and Colton, and yet none were escalated for disciplinary review." Krieger tried to interrupt. "We don't have the resources to escalate every minor flag." Danielle's voice was sharp now. "These weren't minor. These were flagged for evidence tampering and missing timestamps. That doesn't happen accidentally, and it doesn't get ignored by accident." The courtroom had gone quiet again. Even the jury, which had been emotionally worn down, sat up straighter now. Danielle took a breath. "And I'm not here because of a single traffic stop. I'm here because your department cultivated a culture where officers were taught that no one would stop them. Not their peers, not their superiors, and certainly not internal affairs, because IA shared an office wall with the people they were supposed to investigate." The judge raised an eyebrow again. "That's correct," Danielle confirmed. "The Internal Review Division in Paso Robles PD is physically located within the same wing as the Field Operations Unit. Shared desks, shared coffee pot, shared silence." Krieger's mouth twitched. "You're painting with too broad a brush." "No," Danielle said, voice calm again. "I'm just not pretending the brush doesn't exist." At that moment, the courtroom doors opened once more. A federal marshal stepped in, whispering something to the bailiff, who handed the judge a sealed envelope. She opened it, read it, folded it closed. "Lieutenant Krieger," she said, "a federal subpoena has been issued for all internal complaint files from the past 5 years, including those that were archived without review." Krieger's face didn't move, but his eyes flickered. Just once. Understood, Your Honor. He stood, smoothed his uniform, and walked out without another word. Danielle remained seated. Lynn finally broke the silence. We've seen enough to know this isn't just a case. It's a reckoning. Judge Halbrook didn't disagree. She simply said, "We will break until tomorrow morning. This court is adjourned for the day." The gavel hit wood. The room exhaled. As people began filing out, Danielle gathered her things quietly. Reporters surged toward her, but she didn't stop to talk. She moved through them like a current, controlled, steady. She wasn't here to be the story. She was here to finish one. But she knew the hardest part wasn't catching the bad ones. It was what happened next, when the system tried to survive by pretending it had changed. The next morning, the courtroom filled faster than usual. By 8 o'clock a.m., every seat was taken. People who'd never stepped foot in a courthouse before were lined up outside, hoping for a glimpse of something that felt rare. Consequences. Mark and Brian didn't return. They were now federal detainees, awaiting arraignment in Bakersfield. Their lawyers weren't even in the building. Their absence made the courtroom feel lighter, like someone had finally cut the weight off the end of a rope. Danielle arrived through the side entrance, avoiding the press again. Her coat hung open, no badge displayed. She didn't need the badge today. Her work was already sitting in the evidence files. Lynn stood beside her, reviewing last-minute notes. She wasn't nervous, just ready. Judge Halbrook took the bench at 8:31 a.m. She didn't look tired. She looked sharper than ever. The court has reviewed the DEA evidence, audio surveillance, GPS records, whistleblower testimony, and internal documentation provided during these proceedings, she said, voice crisp. Based on the findings and the defense's inability to refute the material presented, this court finds Officers Rutledge and Colton in breach of civil and constitutional rights. Furthermore, this case will be referred for full federal prosecution, and this court recommends charges including falsification of evidence, abuse of power, and conspiracy under color of law. A low rumble went through the gallery. Javier's mother covered her mouth with one hand. Javier himself didn't smile, didn't cry. He just closed his eyes. A long, slow exhale. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Montes, the charges brought against you are dismissed in full. Your record will be sealed and expunged. You are free to go." A whisper of applause started, then stopped. Not because it wasn't deserved, but because the room knew there were still more Javiers out there. Still more courts that hadn't seen this kind of day. Lynn helped Javier up. She patted his shoulder. No speech, no drama. Just a touch that said, "You did it. You made it through." Reporters chased them outside, shouting questions. Javier didn't answer any. He just got into a waiting car with his mom and left. No press conference, no victory lap, just peace. Inside, Danielle stayed seated until the last juror filed out. Only when the room had cleared did Judge Halbrook speak to her directly. "You understand that this case will be watched closely. Every move from this point on, every arrest, every leak, every press release, will be magnified." Danielle gave a small nod. "That's fine. I didn't start this to be comfortable." The judge studied her for a moment, then said quietly, "Neither did I." Danielle left the courtroom through the back. The sun had climbed higher since morning, and the media crowd had drifted toward the street. Still, a few cameras swung her way as she crossed the parking lot. She didn't look at them. Across town, at the Paso Robles Police Department, a quiet storm was brewing. The chief of police had called an emergency meeting behind closed doors. Phones were being confiscated. Internal affairs officers who had kept their heads down were now suddenly reviewing years of paperwork. Fast. The mayor's office released a brief statement. "We support accountability and await the federal investigation's findings." Translation: "We're staying out of this until we know who else is going down." Lynn Tran stood on the steps of the courthouse later that afternoon. She gave a short press statement, not about herself, not even about the verdict. She spoke about procedure, about how small cracks become gaping holes when no one looks closely enough. When asked about Danielle Freeman, she simply said, "That woman is what accountability looks like." Danielle didn't give interviews that week. Instead, she drove 2 hours south, back to LA, and visited a modest one-story home in Oxnard. It belonged to Javier's grandmother. He had mentioned her once, offhand, during a prep session, said she'd raised him for years before he moved in with his mother, said she made tamales every Sunday. Danielle knocked on the door. An elderly woman answered, wearing a housecoat and a look of cautious curiosity. Danielle smiled gently. "I just wanted to say thank you for raising a boy who never stopped telling the truth." The woman didn't say anything at first. Then she opened the door a little wider. Inside, a pot simmered on the stove. Danielle stayed for tea. But long after she left that house, her message remained. Because what she'd done wasn't just about justice. It was about the kind of integrity that survives even when no one's watching. 2 weeks later, Danielle Freeman sat alone on a metal bench outside the federal building in downtown Los Angeles. The traffic hummed behind her. A light breeze carried voices from somewhere down the block, someone selling bottled water, someone arguing over parking. But here, at this hour, she finally allowed herself a moment to stop thinking. No press, no statements, no agents waiting for direction. Just stillness. In her hand she held a yellow envelope. Inside were the final transcripts from the Montes hearing, along with the formal request to open a federal oversight inquiry into the Paso Robles Police Department. The Department of Justice had greenlit it that morning. A full-scale audit, personnel interviews, financials, surveillance reviews. It would all be on record now. She had done her part. Across the plaza, her deputy director, Elisa Browning, was waving her down, but Danielle stayed seated a second longer. Her eyes caught a young man walking by, earbuds in, hoodie pulled over his head. Probably 19, maybe 20. She watched him for a moment, wondering, how many times had someone like him been stopped just because he looked out of place? How many didn't have a Lintran, or a judge willing to listen, or a room full of evidence to finally make someone care? That's the part people never understood about justice. It wasn't just about catching the guilty. It was about protecting those who never should have been targeted in the first place. Later that night, Danielle returned home. An apartment tucked above a bakery in a quiet neighborhood just west of Santa Paula. Nothing fancy, just enough. She fed her dog, sorted the mail, and sat down at her kitchen table, flipping through the notes she'd scribbled during the Montes case. On one torn sheet of paper was a single quote. "Systems don't change when you catch the bad ones. They change when the good ones stop staying quiet." She hadn't written it. Elijah Dunn had. She'd kept it from his resignation letter. Outside, a car drove past, too fast. Tires screeched. Somewhere, a dog barked. Life carried on, just like always. The next morning, she went to speak at a local community college. She hadn't planned to. But Lynn had asked her. Said the students were studying law and ethics and needed to hear from someone who wasn't afraid of pushback. She stood in front of a classroom of 21 students, all ages, different faces, some eager, some tired, all watching her. "I'm not here to tell you how to be a hero," she said. "I'm here to tell you that silence, especially when it's comfortable, is dangerous." She told them about Javier, about the warehouse, about the recordings that nearly disappeared. She didn't glamorize it. She didn't hide the cost either. "You'll be told to look the other way. You'll be told that's just how it is. You might even be offered promotions to stay quiet. But if you choose comfort over truth, don't ever call it justice." Someone in the back raised a hand. A young woman. "Was it worth it?" Danielle didn't answer right away. Then she smiled faintly. "It's not about if it was worth it for me. It's about whether it was worth it for the people who couldn't speak for themselves." The girl nodded. That was enough. Afterward, Danielle walked to her car alone. No protection detail, no agents shadowing her. She didn't need them today. She thought about Javier. He had messaged Lynn a few days earlier, said he'd enrolled back in school, said he'd been approved to drive again, said his mom finally slept through the night without checking the door 5 times. That's what justice looked like. Not gavel slams or headlines, but people breathing again. Before Danielle drove off, she looked in the rearview mirror. Not at herself, but at the courthouse in the distance, still standing, still capable of change. And maybe that was enough to keep going. If you're watching this and you've ever felt silenced, overlooked, or afraid to speak up, don't let fear decide who you become. Justice isn't about being loud, it's about being consistent. Share this story. Subscribe for more truths that too often go unheard. And if you see something wrong, don't wait for someone else to fix it. Be the reason someone else finally gets heard.